Alright, so we've talked a lot about mutations and how those mutations can occur in your body. Today, we're going to take a look at a very specific example of a mutation.
Sickle cell anemia.
Sickle cell anemia, Mr. Howarth, which is a great example of a mutation, and it's a great example of a mutation because it's one of those mutations that, which you're going to find out, given certain circumstances, it can either be a really good mutation or a really bad mutation. So let's just start off by talking about sickle cell anemia, and in order to understand sickle cell anemia, you have to remember a little bit about your red blood cells, which we talked about when we talked about cells a long time ago when we talked about specialized cells. But just remembering these two things about red blood cells will help you understand a little bit about this mutation. So the first is if we could just remember what the function of your red blood cells is. And if Mr. Howarth was paying attention, he could tell you, Mr. Howarth, what's the function of your red blood cells?
To color your blood red.
Absolutely not. So
to carry oxygen from your lungs to the other oxygen-needy things in the room, in the body.
So if you remember your circulatory system here, the job of your red blood cells here is to go ahead and visit your lungs, pick up oxygen, and deliver that all throughout your body. So delivering oxygen to all those cells. And the other thing that we have to remember is the shape of a red blood cell. So if you remember, when we talked about red blood cells, one of the interesting things is they had a very specialized shape that helped them do their job. They're kind of shaped like this flattened round disc that's kind of like a little bit like a donut, a little bit like a cereal bowl, and then it has this indentation. And this is the tough one to remember, is why is a red blood cell shaped that way?
What cereal bowls do you have?
Ones that look like that. Do you remember why red blood cells are shaped this way, Mr.
Because they can hold 4 oxygen things.
Absolutely. So the structure of
hemoglobin.
Yes, the structure of the red blood cell, the cereal bowl shape, is actually designed to increase the surface area of the cell. And that increased surface area allows it to carry more oxygen, just like a cereal bowl can carry cereal.
Does the oxygen sit inside the little bowl?
No,
carry down the
but you know, it's a great analogy. But that's what this shape is there for. It's designed to help it carry oxygen throughout its body. Now let's talk about the sickle cell anemia mutation. So this is a mutation that can occur in your genes, and this mutation, what it does is it causes these cells to change their shape. So for whatever reason you don't produce a certain protein, specifically a protein that interacts with hemoglobin here, and so because they don't produce that protein, they don't have the correct shape they need. And so because they don't have the same shape, they can't do their job of carrying oxygen. And so people who have sickle cell anemia, they have physical pain, they have a lot of problems with blood circulating, they constantly feel tired,
and death.
And yes, one of the most troubling is that you generally have a shortened lifespan.
How short?
Well, it depends. Science has caught up, so people can live, to be much old.
Much old.
I don't have a statistic out here. People are living good lives, but obviously, if you live in a place that doesn't have modern medicine, sickle cell anemia can generally affect your life because obviously you're not getting as much oxygen to the parts of your body that you need to. And you can see here. Here's just a little comparison. So this is what a normal red blood cell looks like. When you have this mutation,
holy crap,
your red blood cells are flattened out into this sickle shape. Kind of looks like a crescent moon. They just don't do the job.
Is that why it's called sickle cell?
Yes.
Because the cells are sickled?
Exactly. So
cool.
They don't have the correct shape. They can't carry oxygen as well as they should. Now, and another thing to mention, and this is just kind of interesting, is that it's an inherited disease. So it's one of those diseases that you can carry and then but not be really affected, and you could pass on to your children. For example, if you have 2 heterozygotes, you could produce a child that has sickle cell anemia, even though you necessarily don't have sickle cell anemia.
So it's recessive.
It's it's a recessive trait. It's also controlled.
Vocab, kids.
Thank you. It's also controlled by multiple genes, so it doesn't work as simple as this, but it works very similar to this mechanism. So you can have some of your blood cells, if you're heterozygous, are actually sickle-celled, but you also have regular ones, so you're able to live just fine, but you can pass that on to your kids. Now, one of the most interesting things about sickle cell is that it's more common in certain places around the world. What you actually see, and this is crazy, but once I explain it, it's going to make sense. If you look, most cases of sickle cell happen generally near the equator, in the tropics, right?
That's racist.
No, it's not. But it's one of those crazy things. Because you say, well, why don't people up here have sickle cell? Why don't people up here have sickle cell? Why don't people down here have sickle cell? Why is it people right in the middle of the world? Why do they have sickle cell? Because it generally seems that you're going to find the dominantly most of the people with sickle cell are found in one region in the world, right? Mm-hmm. So when I explain this, it's going to make a lot of sense. So one thing that sickle cell does, and you mentioned that sickle cell is harmful to you, it can lead to a shorter lifespan, but another thing that it does is it actually also gives you a trait that makes you resistant to malaria.
How?
That's a very good question. Probably has something to do with the virus and how it attaches to your cells or something.
I'll go ask a bio teacher.
Go ask a biologist, epidemiologist who maybe studied this more than I have. But it gives you resistance to malaria, and malaria is just it's a deadly disease that's carried by mosquitoes, right? What's interesting is that even people that are heterozygous or have a heterogeneous genotype have some sort of resistance to malaria. So even if you're a carrier for sickle cell anemia, that gives you a survival advantage over your peers.
Cool.
Right. So this is where the magic comes in.
I'm going to finish the gummy bears. You want some?
If you think about it, Mr. Howarth, right? So if you lived in an area that didn't have mosquitoes and therefore didn't have a lot of malaria, is sickle cell a good thing to have or a bad thing to have?
A bad thing to have.
A bad thing to have.
Your kids could die.
Your kids could die. You have a shortened lifespan. You have problems with circulation. So in this case, in areas where there's no malaria, it's a bad thing to be sickle cell. You'll die early and you have less of a chance of reproducing. But let's flip that. What happens if you live in an area with malaria?
That rhymes.
If you live in an area with malaria, a very deadly disease,
it's better to have sickle cell.
It's better to have sickle cell
Or
because
the carrier.
Or at least be a carrier. Because generally what we see happening is if you're going to die from something,
it's malaria.
You'll die from malaria before the sickle cell kills you. So it turns out in areas with malaria, people with sickle cell actually live longer. Even if they have a shortened lifespan, they live longer than people with malaria, which gives them an opportunity to reproduce and make children. And for genes, it's all about reproducing and make children. Whatever helps you survive longer and make more children, that's what's going to get passed on. So if I go back to this map, you think about these areas here that might have a lot of mosquitoes in the tropics, they might have a lot of malaria. In these areas, having sickle cell gives you a survival advantage because it prevents you from getting the deadly malaria.
So it kills you less faster than the deadlier one.
Exactly.
That's cool and depressing.
Yes. But up here, where there is no malaria,
you die.
You die from sickle cell because you're not getting malaria. The other people aren't getting malaria. They're living longer than you. So it's all about who's living longest and who's making children. So a really interesting example of a mutation. In a very common mutation that can have both positive and negative effects. It's an interesting thing to study. Yeah.